This is Igniting Change, an audio series produced by the FT in partnership with Reckitt.
We're seeing solutions that are coming forward that aren't just useful for COVID or in a time of crisis. A lot of the solutions that we're seeing are actually useful day in, day out in order to improve public health and to improve the constant fights against major diseases that are endemic and bringing universal healthcare to the world. COVID was a watershed moment in many ways. And one way was the change in the psyche of people and how people perceive the threats from infectious diseases and just perceive how precious good health is. My worry is that instead of learning from this and setting up a system where there is more consistency and a standardized way of, accessing the data that is needed in case of a new pathogen emerging, that we don't build this long-term infrastructure or these long-term sort of standards, protocols, agreements, and that we need to do that work all over again.
Hala Audi is the first CEO of the Trinity Challenge, a coalition that aims to use data and analytics to better identify, respond to, and recover from health emergencies. With a career that spans 20 years in law and government, today Hala combines her passion and experience to improve health outcomes and solve complex global health issues through innovation. I'm Sean Kearns, Editor-in-Chief at Longitude, and I sat down with Hala to discuss the role of public-private partnerships in improving global health and the health of the planet, and why data is as critical to overcoming the pandemic as it is to mitigating future crises. The Trinity Challenge was founded by Dame Sally Davies, who many of us know as the UK's former Chief Medical Officer, with the aim of improving preparedness for health emergencies through data and analytics. Hala, what do you think the pandemic has taught us about the importance of data-informed decision-making?
It was so clear at the beginning of the pandemic that so many of the very urgent questions that decision makers were facing lacked enough information and data to inform them. So whether it was the modeling of the infection and the infection growth at the beginning, or knowing whether some of the policy interventions that governments put in place, including social distancing, the wearing of masks, or the need to actually produce from our supply chains PPE, for instance, which was the big issue at the beginning of the pandemics, or now vaccines. All of these incredibly important questions rely on having the best possible information, the right data in the right place at the right time. And this was really difficult at the beginning of the pandemic, but also got organized with the urgency of the start of the pandemic. We really saw collaborations, private to private and private to public, of organizations that started using, for instance, mobility data to be able to model the spread of infection or to get a sense of how social distancing interventions were working. And that access to data made a huge difference. And the Trinity Challenge was really set up with this vision of catalyzing on the energy and the urgency of doing better against COVID this time, but also doing much better next time by organizing a public challenge to bring together the actors that could really make a difference because they held the keys to improvements to the use of data in the public health realm in reaction to health emergencies.
On the point of needing to act, I think a recent letter to the Lancet, the challenge said, "We fear that attention from leaders in government and businesses will wane once this moment of crisis passes." How concerned are you that preparedness for a pandemic could be forgotten again in the future?
So, Sean, I think sadly the pandemic is in many parts of the world is very far from waning. So I think it's a very sad thing to say. The attention will not wane as long as we are in the midst of this pandemic. And it is right now affecting parts of the world in a way that is very different. But we certainly are not seeing the end of it in some parts of the world. And there is this sense that until we overcome it everywhere, we're all suffering from it, both economically and socially. And that's something that's really interesting and encouraging in the kinds of solutions that the Trinity Challenge is drawing around the need to detect and prevent infections better by identifying the risks, but also respond to the risk and recover to the risk. In these three categories of the challenges, we're seeing solutions that are coming forward that aren't just useful for COVID or in a time of crisis. A lot of the solutions that we're seeing are actually useful day in, day out in order to improve public health and to improve the constant fights against major diseases that are endemic and bringing universal healthcare to the world. So, for example, the efforts that we know need to be put in place so that we detect and identify threats earlier, the same infrastructure that will help you do that in case of a new health threat from a new pathogen, they're also useful for better surveillance and better understanding of diseases that exist and that are endemic. And that's a really important point that I think we need to, as a global health community, we need to talk to government and people who are going to make the investments into doing better next time in a way that we're investing in everyday's health being better.
And on that point, Hala, do you think, well, we all know much more about health emergencies now than we did in the past as we lived through one. Do you think that linkage between the health of the planet and public health more generally, do you think that's now better understood in our collective consciousness?
I think we have a major push in understanding that we all need to do. I think you used the word consciousness, and I think that's really important because COVID was a watershed moment in many ways. And one way was the change in the psyche of people and how people perceive the threats from infectious diseases and just perceive how precious good health is. So I think there's something really important here for people thinking about climate change and how climate change will impact on health, to really think about what happened psychologically in all of our minds and what science and high quality behavioral insight studies can give us into what are the best ways to actually change behaviors and improve behaviors in a way that will mitigate climate change, as in will make it less bad, but also will help communities adapt to climate change to the extent that some of it will happen. So that's really important to me. The other sort of really key realization that is now here to stay is the for scientists who have been studying that for years, it's nothing new, but this risk of having animal diseases, so-called zoonotic diseases, spill over into the human sphere is really a risk that is increased by climate change, by disturbing biodiversity, by the increased pressure of population and urban population on the resources of the planet. And that's something that is multifaceted and will continue to need a lot of understanding. But this really relies on the public health community being quite clever about how we set up this improved surveillance system. What is that network and which are the data sources that are needed that might not be within public health agencies at the moment, that might be actually held by private sector organizations, but are needed to benefit public health. How do we make sure we have access to that in a way that is safe, that preserves privacy, that gives people confidence that the data is used in a way that is beneficial and safe, but also what are the technologies that might be needed that are not used in the normal course of business right now by public health organizations, but they're technologies that exist already out there with the big tech firms and some of the smaller niche startups that will enable public health agencies to use this information safely and anonymously. And I think that's a cultural shift and a skills shift that's really important to make. And it won't happen without proactive effort to actually make it.
We've seen with the pandemic lots of changes to the way that the private sector and the public sector work together, we've seen rapid innovation. We've seen collaboration in new forms that we haven't seen previously. How confident are you that that can be maintained, that we'll see previously competing organizations working together, we'll see the public and the private sector working together in new ways? How can that be sustained in the long term?
I believe there's a ratchet effect where there are partnerships that have happened that hadn't happened before. And this has made people realize that these partnerships across sectors, across academia, public sector and private sector are possible, can work. My worry is that instead of learning from this and setting up a system where there is more consistency and a standardized way of, say, accessing the data that is needed in case of a new pathogen emerging, that, we don't build this long-term infrastructure or these long-term sort of standards, protocols, agreements, and that we need to do that work all over again. And I think that's a real risk.
And Halle, you've talked about the fact that the pandemic is still very much with us and its impact is being felt keenly in a number of countries. How do you balance the immediate need to alleviate that suffering with the long-term public health infrastructure that is required? What are the trade-offs?
So that's an interesting question, Sean, because in a lot of policy areas, you have to make these trade-offs between investing for the long term and future generations and investing for today's consumers. That trade-off isn't that hard in the COVID situation because, unfortunately, there is no question that we have to invest today to roll out the vaccines that we have in a way that is as equitable as can be and as fast as can be. And we certainly aren't doing as well as we should be in that sense. And there is no government that isn't throwing every resource it has to the current crisis. But what's really interesting to me is that a lot of the investments that we make today, whether it is in increasing our ability to screen pathogens using genomic technology, whether it is the work that we need to do around behaviors to improve hygiene or improve trust in vaccines, for instance, all the investment that we're making in supply chain and vaccine manufacturing, as well as supply chain distribution of drugs and vaccine to the last mile. All of these investments, all of these efforts that are needed right now, they will also have long-lasting benefits, and they are useful in order to improve access to healthcare over time. And I think that's a really important lesson and a really important message, actually, for people in ministries of finance and government who are looking at the investment, is that there has to be a way to invest to alleviate the crisis today, but in a way that leaves long-term benefits.
And finally, the response to COVID-19 and the ability to put that long-term public health infrastructure in place is going to need a new type of global cooperation. In your role as CEO, how confident are you that that is going to take place over the next few years and we'll see the challenge flourish, hopefully, and new ideas come to life in the spirit of that cooperation?
Yeah, I think I'm quite optimistic, I have to say. Two reasons. One is we've seen global collaboration during the crisis that has been so efficient. When I look at something like COVAX and ACT, for instance, which were set up by countries, global health organizations and private sector and private sector leaders, and when I see the result that they've had in the crisis already, I am optimistic that this has got to go somewhere. And we don't have a choice. Everybody loses unless we set up that kind of global mechanisms to cooperate. If I think about the Trinity Challenge, that's my second cause for optimism. we have seen in the Trinity Challenge the goodwill and the richness of this collaboration between our companies, partners, corporate partners, the academics, and the end users in the charities. And I see it day to day on a lot of the sort of early collaboration efforts that have taken place in the run-up to the challenge. And I see it also in the solutions that are coming across in the challenge pipeline right now. There are a majority of teams are mixed between private sector and public sector, and you really see that cross-fertilization happening. And so this cross-sector collaboration is so much in our DNA that it can't be undone if you want. There is no other way to bring those access to data and new data and analytics techniques to solve these problems. There is no other way than through these cross-sector collaborations.
Hala, that seems an uplifting note on which to end. Thanks again for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
This interview is part of Igniting Change, a campaign produced by Longitude, a Financial Times company, in partnership with Reckitt.